Hi, my name is Jess Nevins, and today I'll be discussing the Vikings, why they're actually pretty cool, some of the new things we've learned about them over the past 30 years, and why they're anything but cliches. The problem with the Vikings is that popular culture and popular histories of the Vikings have led us drastically wrong and given us bad ideas about them. This image from the History Channel TV show Vikings is an example of how the Vikings are portrayed in 21st century popular culture. Their culture is shown to be brutal, even savage. They are portrayed with some sophistication of characterization, however, and there are elements of it which seem to be progressive, such as the presence on battlefields of women warriors, the Shield Maidens. But what we see has been adjusted and repackaged to suit our 21st century sensibilities. This image from the comic book Thor from 1968 is an example of how the Vikings were conceived of from 1811 until the late 20th century. 1811 was the year that the Yiddish Society of Stockholm, Sweden formed. Comprised of members of the Romantic movement, the Yiddish Society became the foremost proponents of the idea of the Vikings as a noble ancient race of morally superior Aryan warriors, as opposed to the decadent Greeks and Romans. Poet Eric Gustav Geyer, a member of the Yiddish Society, wrote a poem, The Viking, in 1811, which did much to propagate this romanticized ideal of the Vikings internationally. For almost 2 centuries after the Yiddish Society was formed, this image of the Vikings held sway in the West. You can see it in comic books, you can see it in book art, and you can see it in movies. The romanticized image of the Vikings replaced the earlier image that had been dominant from the 8th century up through the end of the 18th century. That image, what we might call the original image of the Vikings in the West, was of ferocious and merciless warriors who appeared without warning, slew and enslaved without reason, and were enthralled to barbaric gods. But over the past 30 years, revolutions in what has come to be called the Viking studies have resulted in a new, much more historically accurate understanding of the Vikings. These revolutions have been in various fields: literature, history, and archaeology, the disciplines most traditionally used in Viking studies. But other disciplines have been applied to Viking studies with beneficial results. Some of the new discoveries about the Vikings come from recent archaeological finds, as in the Viking boat burial seen here, discovered in Norway in 2018 through the use of ground-penetrating radar. Some of the new discoveries come from the application of genomics to the remains of the Vikings. Some of the informed reinterpretations of existing materials come from gender studies. Some of the informed reinterpretations of existing materials come from queer studies. This image is of Odin, Allfather of the gods, and contains female as well as male iconography. All of them have contributed to the new view of the Vikings as a complicated people from a complex culture whose belief systems contained surprisingly progressive elements. This image is of a Norse weapons dancer, one of the men who performed sacred dances during certain rituals devoted to Odin, not unlike the Sufi dervishes. So who were the Vikings? When speaking of their own ethnic identity, they wouldn't have called themselves Vikings. To them, Viking meant sea raider or pirate. Nor would they have defined themselves as Norse, Swede, Dane, or any of the other broadly based ethnicities of Scandinavia. Vikings instead defined themselves geographically as belonging to individual kingdoms. So a typical batch of Vikings might consist of men from Vestfold, Alfheimr, Vendil, Halagoland, and so on, rather than consisting of Norse, Swedes, and Danes. But many Vikings were not from modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Over the past decades, several rounds of DNA sequencing have been done on thousands of skeletons from Viking burial grounds. What they've revealed is far more genetic diversity than was previously thought to exist. There were Vikings from the Scandinavian countries, as well as from regions ranging from Spain to Russia. Further, we know that some North Africans joined Viking crews, as did the indigenous Sami people of northern Scandinavia, seen in the picture here. In other words, the average bunch of Vikings would have had a variety of facial features, as well as a variety of hair, eye, and even skin colors. Perhaps 70% of the average Viking crew would be from Scandinavia, but at least 30% would not. And of those 70%, there were likely faces that looked Spanish or Turkish or Moroccan or even Mongolian. The Vikings took slaves from all those places and often married their slaves and had children with them. There was a severe demographic shortage of marriageable Scandinavian women during the Viking Age, so Viking women often took non-Viking women to be their wives. So the average Viking crew really could and likely often was ethnically diverse. Going Viking was something Scandinavian men and occasionally women did only seasonally during the less demanding periods in the agricultural calendar, such as spring and early summer after sowing and the late summer and autumn after the harvest had been taken in. The rest of the time, the great majority of the men and women were farmers, eking out a living from poor soil. Being a warrior and a Viking was for most strictly a part-time proposition. The men and women who went Viking went from lives of domesticity and grinding toil on their farms to lives of freedom, but also violence, often savage violence, and they did this for years on end. In modern society, this sort of life can and often does result in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Although some historians have argued that PTSD is a modern phenomenon, I disagree. Some percentage of Vikings must have experienced PTSD, especially those who went into the berserk state of battle fury and psychological hyperarousal and became berserkers, a word meaning bear skin or animal skin. Berserkers were said to put on the bear skin to go into battle, certainly a traumatic psychological experience for them to undergo. At the end of the Viking Age, former Vikings exhibited signs of mental illness. Quoting one study, "With the end of the Viking epoch, professional warriors found themselves unemployed. Displaced soldiers typically became urban riffraff. Unused to resistance, irascible, and thoroughly unhappy, former Vikings often developed psychoses that plagued the Middle Ages, such as St. Vitus's dance and flagellation, the violent analogues of depression. The very word berserker, like the word Viking, acquired heavily negative connotations. Gangs of such outcasts, young, unmarried, destitute men in their prime, became the bane of farmers' lives in Norway and later in Iceland." End quote. Vikings weren't simple-minded, super-violent men and women. They were people whose experiences with violence would have left them with crippling psychological problems. Some of these Vikings with PTSD would have sought comfort in religion. Others would have attempted to drown themselves in alcohol. But I think most others would have used the same treatments for mental pain that they did for physical pains. The opium poppy, seen here on the left, henbane, seen here on the right, and cannabis in the lower center. None of these three are native to Scandinavia. They would have been acquired via trade with the Abbasid Caliphate of the Middle and Near East, a part of the Vikings' intercontinental trading network. All three plants were a part of the array of natural resources that the Vikings used therapeutically. The Vikings took great care of their sick, wounded, disabled, mentally ill, and those affected by genetic disorders. This ship, discovered at the famous Oseberg ship burial site in Norway in 1904, contained a more or less intact Viking burial ship, full of burial goods and the bodies of two women. The ship was buried in 834, at a time when the average lifespan for Viking women was 40 to 45 years. The younger of the two women in the Oseberg ship was around 50 years old at the time of her death. The older of the two women was between 70 and 80 years old. This is significant because the older of the two women had bones that had fractured and healed during childhood, so she likely had always walked with a limp. And in middle age, she had developed Morgani syndrome, a hormonal disease which flooded her body with testosterone as if she was a very masculine man. Because she had Morgani syndrome, her voice would have deepened considerably, she would have sprouted hair all over her body, including her face. Her bone structure would have thickened, turning her into a hunchback, causing an indentation in her forehead, broadening her jaw, and making her shoulders grow so massive as to drown her neck. The Vikings did not slay her as a witch. They honored her as a Valva, or seer or prophet. Despite her lifelong injuries, childhood and adult sicknesses, she died of a cancer that she'd had for several years. And despite the body changes due to Morgani syndrome, she was cared for all her life and survived into her 70s. She was hardly the only one. In numerous Viking graves, archaeologists have found men and women in their 40s and older with a staggering variety of ailments and conditions, from paraplegia to leprosy. All of these individuals were cared for all of their lives. There was no systematic health care in Viking society, but sick and injured individuals could rely on direct and extended family members to care for them over the course of decades. Gender among the Vikings worked quite differently from what might be expected. Legally, Viking women had an array of rights. They could own property, they could get a divorce for a variety of reasons. After divorce, women were legally entitled to reclaim their dowry. Most marriages were arranged, but the women had the option to refuse their parents' choice of spouses. Women were always in charge of the household affairs, and when their husbands were away, trading or raiding, wives would take charge of the family farm, shop, and or property. If a woman was widowed, she legally owned everything. Many women were buried with rings of keys, symbolizing their roles and power as managers of the household and property. Culturally, however, women had significantly more agency. The reality is that while the Scandinavians of the Viking Age viewed gender as a binary, it wasn't a male-female binary, it was a strong-weak binary, which could be crossed by either gender. Strength was a quality that was not inextricably tied with masculinity, but rather something that both men and women possess. We know of numerous strong Viking women who wielded significant power politically, though few the equal of Audun Deep-Minded, the eminent screes of 9th century Icelandic politics, and the woman pictured here. Audun started as a homeless widow with a child and ended up, through her own efforts and no one else's, engineering the rulership of the Hebrides, the Orkneys, the Faroe Islands, and Iceland, all through her son. Audun was given a full Viking funeral when she died, because she was among the strongest people of her time, male or female. Then there were the Viking women warriors. Over the past 30 years, the bones of Viking warriors exhumed decades ago from various burial sites have been re-examined using the latest in morphological and metric forensic anthropology as well as genomic sequencing. And what's been found is that some of them were women. One prominent example is the famous grave in what had been the trading center of Birka on the island of Björkö, Sweden. The grave was discovered in 1889, and for a very long time most scholars assumed that the person inside the grave had been a man and a high-ranking warrior or even a general, not least because of the items buried with him, including a Nafata set, which is Viking chess, which was used to stimulate strategic thinking, and a full set of weapons and armor. But studies in the 1970s questioned the assumption that the person inside the grave was a man, and a 2017 genomic profile confirmed that the person inside the Birka grave was a woman. This image is what it's thought she looked like in life. While the Valkyrie shown in this silver figurine was fiction, individuals like Astrithr the Red were real. Astrithr the Red, so called because of her flaming red hair, was the foremost Viking pirate, foremost female Viking pirate and raider of the 850s and 860s. Sailing from her home in Rogaland in modern-day Norway with her fleet of 150 ships, all carrying sworn men and women, Estrither pillaged from modern-day Novgorod in Russia to the coast of Spain and all points between. She never allied herself with others and always stayed independent, and thus took far more of the plunder and loot for herself. Nor were the women warriors like Estrither the Red and the female general in the Birkegrave the only individuals among the Vikings to transgress society's expectations as far as gender roles went. The Sami culture of northern Scandinavia has a third gender shamanic figure who has both male and female attributes and behavior from clothing to sex. The influence of the Sami on the Scandinavians of the Viking Age has been the subject of a great deal of scholarly argument over the past century, but one thing that has increasingly become clear over the past 30 years is that their influence was more widespread than previous generations of scholars were willing to estimate. It can be seen even at the top of the Viking religion, in Odin the Allfather himself. He's said in some of the sagas to take part in shamanic exercises, such as his soul leaving his body when he turns into an animal. The Seithur discursive space mentioned in this diagram is a reference to the cultural expectations of and knowledge of Seithur, or magic. Seithur was something that women possessed and that women did. A man who practiced Seithur was thought to have female attributes and to be literally unmanly. From this belief sprang laws and a great deal of rhetoric about how women who practiced Seithur, because they took on women's roles, were gay and therefore abominable. But the Vikings also acknowledged a basic religious paradox. Odin, the Allfather of the gods, the most masculine of the gods, was also the master of Seithur, women's magic. That made him neither male nor female, but in between, third gender. Other differently gendered individuals mentioned in this diagram were the Berserker warriors, who were not fully male because of their frenzied rages on the battlefield, which indicated a feminine loss of control. The Valkyries, who were female but wore men's armor, used men's weapons, and fought like men. The Volur, who were female prophets who used Seithur to foretell the future, and who used very phallic staves in private religious rituals that involved sexual acts with those staves. And Loki, who not only used Seithur, but was called the Spinner, weaving being women's work, and who changed himself into a woman or a mare on at least 2 separate occasions, even getting pregnant and giving birth to children. Odin, the Valkyries, and Loki weren't real, of course, but the Berserkers and the Volur and the Valkyrie-like female warriors were. So were the Seithberender, or men who practiced Seithur. So were the Viking men buried in numerous graves in England with grave goods signifying femininity. So, for that matter, were the female travelers and wanderers who left home dressed in men's clothing. Tied to the issue of gender in Viking society was the complex issue of sexuality. Heterosexuality was the expectation of both men and women, and the Viking legal codes attempted to make it compulsory. But in both religion and real life, what we today think of as gays and lesbians not only existed, but had their sexualities validated. Tied to this reality is a currently popular view of Viking psychology. In this view, Vikings lacked a sense of coherent, constant, and fixed self. Instead of a stable selfhood being contained inside of a separate body, the Scandinavian person was extended and dispersed onto his or her or their social relations and incorporated or possessed materialities, and was in a constant state of flux. Such a dividual or contra-individual mode of personhood Such a dividual or contra-individual mode of personhood could incorporate both masculine and feminine attributes and behaviors at the same time. I mentioned the Vikings' strong-weak binary, in which strength was associated with masculine attributes and weakness was associated with female ones. This binary was often transgressed by men and women. With regard to sexual behavior, this meant that gay men would be accepted socially as long as they were seen as the aggressive, strong, manly member of a couple or throuple. Put bluntly, to be the penetrator, the top, was okay for a man. To be penetrated, to be the passive member, the bottom, was not. A man known as sordin or penetrated was seen as a contemptible being. Calling a man sordin meant that he could be declared an outlaw and banished, and also that the man so labeled would be justified in trying to kill you for calling him that. The likely effect of this belief was that gay couples in Scandinavian society were not entirely scorned. Only the passive member of the couple was. The aggressive member was treated like everyone else. Lesbian and bisexual Viking women in relationships with other women have left less evidence behind than gay couples. Only the Icelandic Christian legal codes mention lesbians. The major Norse myths do not contain any women-loving women couples, although the goddess Freya does make a pass at a woman in one myth. However, there is archaeological evidence that women-loving women couples existed. A piece of jewelry commonly buried with men and women was the bracteate, like the one seen here. Bracteates are thin, flat, single-sided gold medals worn as brooches or pendants. They often bear images of couples or of a single loved one. Traditionally, archaeologists held that bracteates with male-female pairs showed loving couples. But these same archaeologists denied that bracteates with same-sex pairs showed romantic couples, despite these same-sex couples being in the same positions on the bracteates as the opposite-sex couples. It's much less of an assumption to state that the bracteates show same-sex couples than it is to claim that the same-sex pairs in the bracteates are fertility goddesses or men in ritual clothing, as archaeologists have claimed. So the pendant in the slide before this, it was buried with a man in all likelihood showed a male lover. And the bracteate seen here, it was found in a woman's grave and quite likely shows the woman and her female lover. The Viking gods and goddesses are generally assumed to be stereotypically male and female, but there are numerous exceptions to this assumption. For example, this image from a Viking runestone shows Odin, on horseback on the right, being greeted by his wife, the goddess Frigg, on the left. In later myths, Frigg is seen as only Odin's wife, and as not the most important Norse goddess. But the truth is that in the early Viking Age, and before that when Frigg was a Germanic goddess, she was a member of the ruling trio of gods of the pantheon, on par with Odin the Allfather and Tyr the god of war. Frigg was sacrificed to often by the Germanic tribes, and was the equal of Odin, not his inferior. In the later Norse myths, Frigg is reduced to serving Odin when he returns home from his travels, and to being cheated on by him. But in earlier myths, she is said to have had affairs of her own. In these affairs, she is the aggressor rather than the pursued, and her sexuality is portrayed as being a masculine one. The early Vikings would have seen her as a strong, powerful, shame-free goddess. As for Odin, his sexuality can be broken down into the actions the myths showed him taking and the qualities the myths show him possessing. Two very different things. Trigger warning, I'm about to mention a sexual assault. Odin's sexual behavior in the myths is toxically masculine. He is someone who has sex with numerous women and female giants, but he is also a rapist of both, usually as part of one of his schemes to gain magical power. To be the sexual aggressor toward women was approved of by Viking society. To cheat on one's wife and to rape women were not. Odin would have been seen by the Vikings as a kind of case study in which too much masculinity, too much male sexuality, leads to bad ends. But Odin's qualities and attributes tell a much different story. Odin is the master of Seidr, the female magic. Because Seidr is innately women's art, Odin's mastery of it makes him both male and female, or third gender. And because he has male genitalia and engages in women's work, he becomes Ergi. Ergi meant a man with womanly sexual inclinations, specifically someone who desired to be penetrated by a man and who acted on that desire. To be Ergi was to be weak, to be shameful. Moreover, while Odin has a personal guard of male warriors, he is also associated with the all-female Valkyrie. In his role as master of women's magic, he is linked to the goddess Freya, the goddess of magic. In his role as a trickster, he changes shape and wears women's clothing. And the wisdom, foresight, and sound advice he was known for were seen as female attributes, not male. Odin was a complex figure for the Vikings, neither wholly male nor wholly female, but balanced halfway between the two poles. Queer seems an accurate descriptor. There's also Loki, seen here on the left with his back to us. Loki is a transgressive figure in the myths. He's the son of a giant father and a goddess mother, the reverse of the usual pairing. He is either an ally, a friend, or an enemy of the gods, depending on the myth. He is inconstant. Unlike every other god, Loki has no function, nor no portfolio. He is a trickster, someone who bends words and avoids breaking his oaths through semantics, unlike the other honor-bound gods and goddesses. He is called a god rather than a goddess, but his name, Loki, derives from the Germanic root luk, which denoted things that had to do with loops and knots. Denotations, which were associated with Loki and strongly implied a tie to weaving and spinning, both of which were women's work. Sexually, Loki is everything. He has a wife and mistresses who bear his children, but he also uses his shape-shifting abilities to turn into women for sexual purposes. In one myth, Loki turns into a mare, has sex with and becomes pregnant by a giant stallion, and gives birth to Odin's horse Sleipnir. In other myths, Loki is said to have turned into a woman and had affairs with other women and men and gods and goddesses, and even to have given birth to children. Much of what we know about the Viking religion and myths are courtesy of Snorri Sturluson, pictured here. Sturluson was a 13th century historian and poet who compiled the Prose Edda, also known as the Elder Edda. The Prose Edda is our main historical source for Norse mythology. However, it was compiled 200 years after the Viking Age ended by Sturluson, a Christian zealot who expunged as many of the queer elements from the mythology as possible, and further queer-washed the myths by including in the Prose Edda only those myths which could be made to tell a linear account of the gods. Most of the original myths that we can find evidence of are internally contradictory, have variant endings, and in general are singular stories rather than part of a continuous unbroken mythology. In the Prose Edda, Sturluson kept only those myths that told an overarching story, which, not coincidentally, left out the myths with queer elements. Sturluson and other writers and historians like him distorted the accounts of what the Vikings actually did in their daily lives and while raiding, so that current beliefs about the Vikings are often at odds with the historical realities. One example of this is our association of the Vikings with violence. The Vikings certainly raided widely, pillaged, took many captives, and forcibly colonized foreign territories. But as a rule, the Vikings were largely a peaceful people. A 2018 study of skeletal remains in Viking graves in England and across Scandinavia showed that traces of weapons injuries were rare. Similarly, skeletal remains of Viking women, children, and men who were farmers or craftsmen showed a much lower rate of domestic violence than in other contemporary Northern European cultures. Religion was so deeply embedded into the culture of the Vikings that they didn't have a word for it and simply spoke of it as Sith, the custom. Religious holidays, publicly held religious rituals, and religious rituals conducted privately for worshippers of a particular god, goddess, or animal spirit were all common. Magic was an integral part of the Sith. The Vikings didn't have just one magical system, they had several. The systems all had the same underpinnings in the Viking religion, but each system took a very different approach to how magic could be manipulated and expressed. I've already mentioned Seithir, which was the most prominent form of Viking magic. In this image you see the heads of the magic staves of the Seithir women, through which their spells were cast. The Vikings believed in and used a system of magic called Galdr. Galdr's etymological root is the same as Gala, which means to scream shrilly like a crow. Galdr was a high-pitched chant which was only available to sopranos. It produced magical songs that were reportedly pleasing to the ear and had a unique rhythm. It was most often used for cursing men and animals with various diseases and afflictions. Another magic system was Gandr. The etymological root of Gandr is related to the core of the Gununga Gap, the cosmic void before the creation of the world, and Gandr was suggested to be one of the primal forces from which the world was formed. This would imply that Gandr magic was seen as not only very powerful, but also very serious, very grave magic. The Norse Volur, or female prophets, used Gandr in conjunction with Seithir to foretell the future. Udaseta means sitting out, and was not so much a specific magic ritual as a technique to put other rituals and magic spells into effect. Just as Odin ritually spoke with the dead, so did practitioners of Udaseta commune with the dead. Udaseta involved sitting alone outside at night in special places such as burial mounds, by running water, or beneath the bodies of the hanged, in order to receive spiritual power and wisdom from the dead. The rituals performed by Odin form a category all their own. The poems in the Norse Eddas make it clear that most of Odin's rituals are not available to humans and are only available to Odin because of the sacrifices he has made, losing an eye and castrating himself on his various quests for magical knowledge. These rituals usually involve the runes of the Norse alphabet, the younger Futhark seen here. There are other things I could tell you about the Vikings. Which of the Viking gods were actually holdovers from the pantheons of the Bronze Age inhabitants of Scandinavia? Why Odin was the most popular god with royalty and the rich and powerful, while Thor was most popular with the freemen and the slaves, but at the same time the most cursed at by them. I could tell you about the Disir, the female war spirits more powerful than the Valkyrie, who weave the fates of men in battles on a loom made of human body parts. I could even tell you about the giantess Hirokin. She was a witch and a total badass who rode a giant boar, used snakes for the boar's range, and who was stronger with one arm than Thor was with both of his. But I'm running out of time. As I hope I've begun to demonstrate, Vikings and their culture are flexible enough to tell any story. If you want to tell a metaphorical story about the effects of climate change and the environmental collapse, the Vikings are perfect for it. One of the reasons they went raiding was dramatic climate change and environmental instability. If you want to tell a Game of Thrones style political thriller, Viking history is full of suitable characters and intrigues. If you want to write a low fantasy or a high one, Viking culture, magic, and mythology can suit you. If you want to write a romance, or a crime story or a horror story, or simply a straightforward non-genre story or novel, the Vikings are flexible enough to accommodate you. They're pretty neat. Thank you.